It often began not with death, but with youth. A kamikaze pilot was rarely an old man hardened by decades of war. He was usually a boy in his late teens or early 20s, still carrying the softness of a life barely lived. Many were students only months earlier learning literature, engineering, or philosophy before the war pulled them from classrooms and placed them inside uniforms stitched with imperial symbols. To understand the life of a kamikaze, one must begin here, in this fragile space between boyhood and obligation. Where personal dreams quietly dissolved into national duty, Japan in the early 1940s was a nation consumed by total war. The empire framed the conflict not merely as a military struggle, but as a sacred mission. From childhood, young men were taught that the emperor was divine, that Japan's survival was inseparable from his honor, and that self-sacrifice was the highest form of loyalty. These ideas were not whispered. They were drilled into daily life schools, ceremonies, textbooks, and radio broadcasts all reinforced the same message. Dying for the emperor was not portrayed as tragic. It was portrayed as beautiful. For many future kamikaze pilots, military service began as compulsory conscription. Others volunteered under immense social pressure, where refusal was nearly unthinkable. To decline was to risk shame, not just personal shame, but dishonor for one's family, ancestors, and village. In some units, officers would ask who wished to volunteer for the special attack forces. Technically, hands were raised voluntarily. In reality, the room was silent, tense, and suffocating. Not raising one's hand marked a man forever. Most raised their hands. Training camps were harsh, rigid, and emotionally controlled. Physical punishment was common. Beatings were justified as discipline. Pain was reframed as purification. Pilots were trained quickly, often inadequately, because Japan no longer had the luxury of time. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Planes were outdated. Instructors knew many of these young men would never return, and so the training focused less on survival and more on obedience, precision, and mental conditioning. The objective was not to create elite aviators, it was to create unwavering resolve. Despite the brutality, daily life in training was strangely ordinary. Young men laughed, complained about food, shared cigarettes, and spoke quietly about home. At night, they wrote letters to parents and siblings, careful to sound brave. Many concealed their fear even from themselves. The military discouraged expressions of doubt. A kamikaze was expected to be calm, cheerful, and grateful for the honor assigned to him. Fear was treated as weakness, and weakness had no place in a divine mission. Religion and ritual played a central role in shaping their mindset. Shinto beliefs emphasized purity, ancestral spirits, and unity with the emperor. Buddhist ideas about impermanence softened the terror of death. Before missions, pilots would participate in ceremonies sipping sake, receiving white headbands inscribed with slogans like "Certain Victory" or "7 Lives for the Emperor." These rituals transformed death into a passage rather than an end. By surrounding the act with symbolism, the military turned suicide into sacrifice, yet beneath the surface, contradictions lived. Diaries later recovered reveal private doubts and quiet despair. Some pilots wrote about wanting to live, about unfinished dreams, about love left behind. They were not ignorant of death. They understood it intimately. But they were trapped inside a system where individual life mattered less than collective meaning. Many did not believe the war could be won. Some suspected their missions were militarily pointless. Still, they went. The life of a kamikaze was defined not by one final moment, but by the slow narrowing of choices. Each day brought them closer to an irreversible path. Once assigned to a special attack unit, retreat became impossible. To back out would disgrace one's family and comrades. The weight of expectation was unbearable, yet invisible. Smiles were practiced. Courage was performed. Silence became survival. As Japan's military situation worsened in 1944, kamikaze missions increased rapidly. American naval superiority had shattered Japan's air power. Conventional tactics failed. The solution, commanders believed, was to turn human bodies into weapons. Kamikaze attacks were meant to shock the enemy psychologically and compensate for technological inferiority. Each pilot was told that one successful strike could change the course of battle. This promise gave meaning to the unimaginable. Daily routines continued even as death loomed. Pilots cleaned their planes, ate simple meals, and attended briefings that spoke of honor rather than odds. Friendships grew intense. Bonds formed quickly when time was limited. Many pilots made promises to meet again in the afterlife. Some joked about racing to the enemy ships. Humor became a shield against terror. Laughter filled spaces where screams might otherwise have lived. Letters written during this period are among the most haunting records of the kamikaze experience. Official letters were censored and filled with patriotic language. Private notes, hidden or written moments before departure, tell a different story. They speak of regret, longing, and love. Many pilots apologized to their parents for dying before repaying their kindness. Others expressed guilt for causing grief. Even in death, they worried more about those left behind than about themselves. The military encouraged families to feel pride rather than sorrow. Parents were expected to smile at farewell ceremonies, to bow deeply, to accept the sacrifice as an honor. Mothers wept in silence. Fathers swallowed their pain. Grief became a private act, hidden behind national duty. The life of a kamikaze did not end with the pilot, it extended into the lives of those who survived him. Psychologically, kamikaze pilots lived in a state of suspended reality. Death was certain, but the timing was unknown. Some waited weeks or months for their mission orders. Each morning could be the last. This uncertainty distorted time. Days felt unreal. Life became a ritual of waiting. Some pilots described feeling already dead, as if their bodies continued moving after their souls had departed. Not all kamikaze pilots were fanatics. Many were ordinary young men trapped in extraordinary circumstances. They were shaped by propaganda, but not emptied of humanity. Their obedience was not proof of mindlessness, it was evidence of how powerful ideology, social pressure, and fear can be when combined. The tragedy of the kamikaze lies not in their willingness to die, but in how thoroughly their right to live was stripped away. As the day of departure approached, pilots were often moved to forward airfields. These bases were closer to enemy fleets and farther from home. The air smelled of fuel, oil, and ocean wind. Mechanics worked tirelessly to keep aging aircraft operational. Planes were stripped of unnecessary equipment to increase speed and explosive capacity. Parachutes were often removed. Survival was no longer part of the equation. The night before a mission was heavy with ritual and silence. Pilots shared one final meal, drank sake, and posed for photographs that would later be sent to families. Some sang traditional songs. Others sat alone, staring into darkness. There was no dramatic speech that erased fear. There was only acceptance or the performance of it. Each man faced the coming dawn in his own way. This was the life of a kamikaze before the flight. Not a single moment of madness, but a long journey of conditioning, pressure, fear, and quiet humanity. To see them only as weapons is to miss the deeper truth. They were not born to die. They were taught to believe they should. Morning arrived quietly, almost mercifully. There were no alarms, no sudden shouts, no dramatic signal announcing that this day was different from all others. Yet every man in the barracks knew. The air itself felt heavier, as if it carried knowledge that words could not express. For the kamikaze pilot, mission day did not begin with fear, it began with a strange calm, the kind that settles when there is no longer any decision left to make. They were awakened before dawn, gently but firmly. Officers moved through the barracks with controlled efficiency, avoiding eye contact, as if to acknowledge the pilots as individuals might weaken the ritual. The pilots rose from their beds, folded their blankets neatly, and dressed in silence. Each movement was deliberate. Boots were tied carefully. Flight suits were smoothed as though appearance still mattered, even now. In these small acts of order, they clung to dignity. Outside, the airfield was wrapped in mist. The horizon barely existed, blending sky and ground into a single pale blur. Engines rested silent, lined up like sleeping beasts. Mechanics stood ready, but they spoke little. Everyone understood that words could not improve what was about to happen. The kamikaze pilots walked among the planes, some touching the metal fuselage gently, almost affectionately. These machines were not simply tools. They were the final companions of their lives. Before departure, there were rituals unchanged, precise, and deeply symbolic. Small cups of sake were distributed. Each pilot drank slowly, aware that this might be the last taste they would ever know. Headbands were tightened, white cloth against skin, slogans pressed into foreheads like final commands. Some bowed toward a distant direction, Tokyo, the imperial palace, the emperor. Others closed their eyes briefly, whispering prayers no one else could hear. Letters were collected. Final photographs were taken. Smiles appeared where fear lived, practiced expressions meant for families who would receive these images weeks later, long after the truth was already known. Cameras clicked. The moment was frozen youth captured just before annihilation. The photographers did their work efficiently, perhaps to avoid thinking too deeply about the faces in their frames. When the briefing ended, the pilots were dismissed with short, formal instructions. No speeches about glory. No dramatic farewells. The language of command was restrained, almost sterile. This was intentional. Emotion was dangerous. Emotion could break discipline. And discipline was the final armor these men possessed. As each pilot approached his assigned aircraft, the world narrowed. Sounds became distant. Faces blurred. The vastness of war shrank into a cockpit barely large enough to breathe inside. Strapping into the seat was both familiar and foreign. Some pilots felt their hands shake for the first time. Others felt nothing at all, as if their bodies had entered a numb, protective state. There were no parachutes. Everyone knew why. The absence of that simple object transformed the plane into something else entirely, not a vehicle of war, but a sealed promise. Once airborne, there would be no return, no alternative ending. The sky itself became a one-way path. Engines roared to life one by one, shattering the quiet of dawn. The vibrations traveled through metal and bone alike. The smell of fuel mixed with ocean air. As the planes taxied into position, pilots glanced sideways at one another, sharing fleeting looks that carried entire lifetimes of meaning. These were not looks of excitement. They were acknowledgments. I see you. I know what this costs. Takeoff was swift. There was no applause, no cheering. Wheels left the ground and Japan fell away beneath them. Villages, forests, coastlines, everything they had ever known receded into distance. Some pilots felt a sudden surge of clarity at that moment, an intense awareness of beauty. Others felt crushing regret. For many, both emotions collided at once. Once in the air, formations tightened. The sea stretched endlessly below, calm and indifferent. Radio silence was enforced. There was nothing left to say. Each pilot was alone inside, his thoughts accompanied only by the steady rhythm of the engine. Time behaved strangely. Minutes felt like hours. Hours collapsed into moments. This was the period many survivors, those whose missions were aborted due to mechanical failure or weather, later described as the most psychologically unbearable. Not the impact, not the explosion, but the waiting, the slow approach towards certainty. With no distractions, the mind turned inward, replaying memories with painful clarity. Childhood homes, mother's voice, a friend's laughter, a life that could have been. Some pilots spoke aloud to themselves. Others screamed into the empty cockpit, unheard by anyone. A few prayed. A few cursed the war, the commanders, even the emperor, thoughts they would never have dared to express on the ground. In the sky, beyond surveillance and judgment, honesty sometimes surfaced for the first time. As enemy ships came into view, the illusion of purpose sharpened. Smoke rose from the horizon. Anti-aircraft fire dotted the sky with black bursts. The danger became immediate, tangible. Training took over. Fear compressed into focus. Pilots adjusted their course, tightened their grip, and aimed their planes downward. In those final minutes, ideology fought with instinct. Every human impulse screamed to survive, to pull up, to flee. But years of conditioning pressed harder. Honor, duty, family, emperor. These ideas flooded the mind, overpowering the primal urge to live. The kamikaze was not an act of madness, it was the tragic triumph of indoctrination over instinct. Some planes were shot down before reaching their targets. These pilots died anonymously, swallowed by the sea, their sacrifices unrecorded. Others struck ships directly, explosions tearing steel and flesh alike. The impact was instantaneous. There was no time for reflection at the end, only force, light, and obliteration. For those who survived failed attempts, engines malfunctioning, targets lost, orders aborted. The aftermath was often worse than death. They returned to base carrying unbearable guilt. To live when one was supposed to die was seen as dishonor. Many begged for reassignment. Some were sent again. A few survived the war, haunted by what they had been prepared to do. The mission did not end with the explosion. Its echo continued in grieving families, in propaganda reports, in the quiet shame of defeat that followed Japan's surrender. The kamikaze pilots were praised publicly, mourned privately, and debated endlessly after the war. Were they heroes? Victims? Fanatics? The truth lies uncomfortably in between. In their final hours, kamikaze pilots were neither monsters nor myths. They were human beings walking a path designed by forces far larger than themselves. Their lives were consumed not only by war, but by the idea that dying was the highest form of living. And that idea, once planted, proved more powerful than fear itself. When the war ended, the silence that followed was unlike anything Japan had ever known. Cities lay in ruins, the empire shattered, and the divine certainty that had fueled sacrifice dissolved almost overnight. For the kamikaze pilots who never returned, there was no closure, only absence. For those who survived, and for the families of those who did not, the end of the war marked the beginning of a different kind of suffering, one defined not by explosions, but by memory, guilt, and unanswered questions. Families received official notices weeks or months after their sons had departed. The language was formal and reverent, filled with phrases of honor and eternal glory. There were certificates, sometimes medals, and photographs taken just before departure. Mothers unfolded these papers with shaking hands. Fathers read them silently, faces rigid. Publicly, grief was expected to be restrained. Privately, it was overwhelming. Many parents struggled with the contradiction. They had been forced to accept that their child's death was both a national honor and a personal catastrophe. In villages and towns across Japan, portraits of fallen kamikaze pilots were displayed during memorials. Their names were spoken with reverence. Schoolchildren bowed before their images. Yet behind closed doors, families questioned everything. Was it necessary? Did it matter? Could their sons have lived? These questions had no safe place to be asked. In the immediate post-war years, Japan was rebuilding physically and psychologically. There was little room for open reckoning with the moral weight of what had been demanded of its youth. For the few kamikaze pilots who survived, those whose missions were aborted, whose planes malfunctioned, or who were recalled, the burden was uniquely cruel. They returned alive into a society that no longer celebrated the cause they had been prepared to die for. Some felt profound shame for surviving. Others felt anger, confusion, or relief mixed with guilt. Many remained silent about their experiences for decades, unable to reconcile the life they were given back with the death they had already accepted. As Japan underwent occupation and demilitarization, the narrative surrounding the kamikaze shifted. The emperor renounced his divinity. The ideology that had framed death as sacred collapsed. What had once been called heroism was now viewed with discomfort. The kamikaze became symbols of fanaticism to some, tragic victims to others. The nation struggled to decide how to remember them, whether to honor their sacrifice or condemn the system that consumed them. Historians later uncovered diaries, letters, and testimonies that revealed the inner lives of these pilots with heartbreaking clarity. These documents dismantled the myth of blind devotion. They showed young men who loved poetry, worried about their parents, feared death, and doubted the war. The kamikaze were not immune to humanity. They were overwhelmed by circumstances that stripped them of meaningful choice. Their final acts were shaped less by hatred of the enemy than by loyalty to expectations imposed upon them. Memorials dedicated to kamikaze pilots still exist in Japan today. Some are solemn, others controversial. Visitors leave flowers, fold paper cranes, and read inscriptions that speak of courage and sacrifice. Critics argue that such memorials risk glorifying suicide and militarism. Supporters insist they honor lost lives without endorsing the ideology that killed them. This tension reflects a broader struggle within Japan's historical memory: how to mourn without mythologizing, how to remember without repeating. Internationally, kamikaze attacks remain one of the most emotionally charged aspects of World War II. For Allied sailors who survived these attacks, the trauma was profound. Kamikaze strikes were terrifying precisely because they defied logic and self-preservation. To face an enemy who sought death as a weapon was psychologically devastating. In this way, the kamikaze achieved part of their intended effect: not strategic victory, but lasting fear and shock. Yet fear alone cannot define their legacy. The deeper lesson of the kamikaze lies in how ordinary people can be led to extraordinary ends. It reveals the power of ideology, social pressure, and nationalism when combined with youth and obedience. It shows how a society under existential threat can redefine morality, transforming self-destruction into virtue. The kamikaze were not anomalies, they were products of a system that valued symbols more than lives. In the decades since the war, survivors' testimonies have slowly emerged. Elderly men, once silent, finally spoke of sleepless nights, of friends lost, of missions they never flew. Their voices are calm, reflective, often heavy with regret. Few speak with pride. Most speak with sorrow. They do not ask to be praised. They ask to be understood. The life of a kamikaze does not end at the moment of impact. It echoes through generations in families shaped by loss, in a nation grappling with its past, and in a world still learning how easily human beings can be convinced to die for ideas. Their story is not one of simple heroism or simple madness. It is a warning, written in human lives, about what happens when obedience replaces conscience and when duty eclipses compassion. To remember the kamikaze truthfully is to see them as they were. Young men caught between love for their country and love for life, guided toward death by forces they did not create. They were not born weapons. They were made. And in understanding how they were made, we confront uncomfortable truths about war itself, truths that remain relevant long after the engines have gone silent.